So, okay, so we're recording, great. So thanks, Elizabeth, and also very warm welcome from my side to this workshop. I'm really happy actually to speak to you today about this topic, because I believe that the future of the fiscal policy framework of the European Union doesn't yet get enough attention. And, you know, I get it. Fiscal policy sounds really boring, but I think, you know, this is a mistake. I believe the decision on the future of the European fiscal framework is really a make or break moment for the future of the whole European Union, because right now it's going to be decided if after 2023 the European Union is going back to its old framework, and whether or not we are going to see yet another wave of fiscal consolidation and austerity. And I'm saying that this is a make or break moment because there is increasing evidence that the period of fiscal consolidation and austerity in response to the 2008 crisis was in fact the major driver of anti-EU populism. And there are many studies on this, but there is one that has been published in the American Economics Review that I found particularly fascinating. In that study, Timo Vetter looks into causal links between Brexit and austerity. And he finds that indeed there's a very strong association between people that were impacted by austerity and pro-Brexit votes. And he comes to the conclusion that the EU referendum could have resulted in a Remain victory had it not been for austerity. So there's very clear evidence today that anti-EU sentiments and the consequences of that are clearly linked to austerity. And it's no wonder that this is the case, I would say. The period of fiscal consolidation after the 2008 crisis has led to a double-dip recession in Europe. Here in the left graph, you see GDP figures of the EU compared to the US. And what you can see here is that the US didn't see a double-dip recession, but the EU did. And the major difference was that the US didn't impose austerity on the economy, but they instead invested a lot. And the consequences for economically less strong EU countries of that were quite severe, to be frank. So when you take away the possibility to invest into bouncing back from a crisis, it gets very difficult for a country like Greece to recover from a deep crisis like 2008. As we can see here, they still didn't fully recover. So for instance, youth unemployment in 2019 was still not as low as it was before the crisis, and that was actually before the Corona crisis, okay? And that's not all. Karanikolos and others show in a very interesting study that preventable death were even a consequence of austerity because there were cuts in spending for public health. And you know, I think it's pretty understandable that people kind of get a negative image of the institution that imposes fiscal consolidation on them in such a situation when it has this type of severe consequences. So I think it's absolutely great that this time we do have the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which provides 672.5 billion euros for recovery of the European Union economies. And you know, it shows. So in Italy, for instance, where you typically have very loud anti-EU populists, what you can see there right now is they're pretty quiet. And they are quiet probably mostly because the European Union just invested 190 billion of the RRF into Italy, and that equals roughly 10% of the Italian GDP, and that's quite a lot of money. And it's very difficult to argue against that, I would say. So I think let's not do the same mistake again, and let's not initiate another wave of austerity after 2023. And I think this is especially important because today is not 2008, and we don't only have to save the economy, but it increasingly gets clear that we need to invest also to transform our economies so they get ecologically sustainable. And Ursula von der Leyen just a few days ago said again that there will indeed be additional financial resources to make that happen. And we did a study on how transformative the recovery and resilience plans of EU countries are in terms of transforming to ecological sustainability. And one of the findings was that even though the EU is already doing a really, really good job by binding 37% of the recovery and resilience facility to green investments, this is unfortunately still not yet enough to make our economies really climate neutral. There's still a need of roughly between, depending on estimations, 250 to 800 billion of additional yearly investments on top of private investments. And I think it's very important to acknowledge here that we're not only talking about loans, but that it's also important to have grants, because there are business models that are needed in the transformation, but they don't yet have a business case. So the market alone won't solve this. There's a clear need for government investments also. So long story short, I would say there's a dire need for reform of the existing fiscal framework, which would severely constrain government budgets after 2023, and that would potentially cause quite existential problems for the European Union, and also make it far more unlikely to get the ecological transformation going fast enough. So I'm very happy to have this event today together with you, where we will discuss different reform proposals. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jakob, for your introduction and for setting the scene. I will very gladly pass over to Niels Thygesen next. Niels Thygesen is the chairman of the European Fiscal Board and Professor Emeritus of International Economics at the University of Copenhagen, and he'll discuss a bit why fiscal policy reform is important and the context there. So please, Niels, take it away.
Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to Jakob Heffele for inviting me for this very timely meeting. Indeed, it is timely because we are recovering well, unexpectedly well, I should say, from the pandemic. And it's time to contemplate what should the fiscal rules or the rules-based economic governance in Europe look like once we have recovered from the pandemic. It's timely also because the European Commission President, in a speech on the 15th of September, announced that the Commission will now relaunch the discussion or the consultations with member states on how to reform the rules, and that there's a fairly short time horizon for that operation. The basis of the rules are fundamentally de facto suspended at the present time. They were suspended at the outbreak of the pandemic in March last year. But the intention is, in view of the strength of the recovery, that the special exemption, the escape clause, will lapse at the end of 2022. And that means that in the course of the next 6 to 9 months, there should be some idea on what policy recommendations should be given for 2023. Now, this announcement by the Commission, which in the view of the European Fiscal Board was certainly most welcome, was not, I think, applauded greatly by member states, because opinions are very divided currently among member states. One group of countries believes basically that return to the previous rule-based framework, but preferably implemented more rigorously than in the past, would be feasible, would be the best option. And they see no particular urgency in completing discussions, therefore, because they would return basically to the old rules. Another group of countries finds that the basic environment has changed sufficiently to say that one cannot go back to rules without a fundamental reform, even including major legislative steps. And that makes it hard to see, of course, how in a short while one can bridge the gap between these two. In the European Fiscal Board, I think we are a little bit more optimistic in the sense that there are both elements of continuity from the past system, from the basic motivation of having rules at all, and from some of the new challenges that are well recognized by everybody that should make it possible to reach some kind of compromise. And in that spirit, let me start with a more historical perspective on why we have the fiscal rules. Of course, when the Economic and Monetary Union was started or decided in 1991-92, the main emphasis was on the creation of a single currency, ultimately after a few transition years, and with a single central bank to manage that currency. And much attention was spent in describing how that would work. But almost as much time and certainly more controversy arose around the fiscal underpinnings of such a system. One reason I think for that was that it was recognized that one could not simply allow divergent national policies outside the monetary area to have a free hand. There had to be some constraints. And in the previous system, exchange rate crisis had played that role. They triggered policy consultations and adjustments that made policies a bit more consistent between countries. But once you have a single currency, of course, that kind of crisis disappears. Some said at the time, but member states will now recognize that the long-term budget constraint, you can no longer escape from discipline by devaluing your currency. That would be enough. And we will underline that by saying that you are not supposed to take on the debt of other countries in the European Union. The horizon of policymakers was one instrument that was foreseen. The other one was that market discipline, financial markets would help to make that vision of a budget constraint clearer. But that vision was downplayed in the preliminaries to the Maastricht Treaty already by saying financial markets are too patient for a long time and then they suddenly react too strongly. So the double failure in a sense of both the long-term horizon of policymakers and the reliability of market reactions put fiscal rules-based fiscal governance into the center of attention. And that was the core. And the main thing to prevent in the Maastricht Treaty seen at the time was a spillover from building up a very high levels of debt that would risk fiscal unsustainability and therefore consequences also for other countries, ultimately an existential crisis in the euro area as a whole. And that remains, I think, the core concern for the European Union, that unsustainable policies of fiscal nature can undermine the economic union if they persist for a sufficiently long period of time. In that perspective, the ceilings for deficits and in particular the long-term norm for debt was set up in 1992. Some said these figures are totally arbitrary. They were not totally arbitrary in the sense that they represented average behavior at the time. 3% was roughly the deficit. And some countries like France had experimented with the 3% rule prior to the formation of EMU. So it was not totally foreign territory. But of course, it was somewhat arbitrary. And at the time, even two countries had more than twice the level of the debt norm of 60%, Belgium and Italy. So the emphasis from the start was for a gradual adjustment process towards more normal behavior and standards. So the advice was to countries, we may have gone far enough in terms of fiscal boldness in the European Union. Maybe we should stop here and accept that it would be risky to go further. But there was no very firm determination to control that process year by year in a very intrusive way. That somewhat has come back into the picture in subsequent reforms, and that also needs to be viewed very critically. Persuasive as some of these arguments they seem now that, and in fact, the weaker economists saw it as a reasonable bargain that they should show some fiscal prudence in return for getting a stable monetary environment with lower interest rates than they could obtain themselves. That looks outdated today for a double reason. First, sustainability does have a very different meaning in 2021 from 30 years ago. With low interest rates, a trend-wise decline in the real interest rate over this period of time, more or less, has meant that you can have low interest rates without much fiscal prudence, apparently. And that impression, of course, undermines respect for the notion of sustainability. Secondly, there's been a revival of the positive view, let's say the more idealistic view of what fiscal policy can do. Strong fiscal action was obviously necessary in the deep crisis we've seen first in 2008-9 when the financial crisis struck, and now in the pandemic crisis of 2020. So fiscal action, both nationally and some coordinated expansion in the EU on both occasions, was chosen. And in the case of the pandemic, of course, supplemented by the first really joint initiative in the European Union of a fiscal nature, the Recovery and Resilience Facility already referred to. This was a very promising development. But the whole atmosphere on fiscal policy is a bit more optimistic and activist these days than it was not only at the time of Maastricht, but also at most times in between 91 and 2021. So governments are more difficult to rein in today. They see a more essential role for fiscal policy and view fiscal rules with more suspicion. Let me summarize the situation by mentioning the challenges in the current environment of finding a compromise between continuity and reform. First, as I said, the notion of sustainability has to be restored to some respectability and some concreteness. I do think, and we believe that in the European Fiscal Board, that you need some numerical targets, even if they are distant. They can form a target that you can aim for over long horizons. And it can be followed up by medium-term plans by governments when they come into office. So a quantitative debt norm in the long run is an essential element. And we believe also that the deficit rule can be helpful in preventing at least some of the more alarming developments in public debt if you keep to the 3% deficit rule. So some elements of continuity, a lot of refinement has been made to the analysis of sustainability, but it does also have to be said that the debt objectives for countries, given the very difficult starting positions, have to be recognized that they must be somewhat differentiated. That can be done through the speed of adjustment rather than by choosing different long-term, very long-term debt targets. The second point is that if you look back over the past 30 years, debt ratios in the euro area as a whole have gone up from about 60% on the average to now about 100%. In the high debt countries such as France and Spain, they have doubled approximately to 120%. If you look at the 30 years as a whole, the reason for this rise in the debt is as much due to long-term underlying trend of expenditures outgrowing public revenues, as it is to the two major jumps in the debt ratio caused by the crisis, the financial crisis, and by the pandemic crisis. And this long-term, almost inexorable pressure for public expenditure to rise is something that must be contained in the long term to retain sustainability of public finances in the European Union. The third point is that, as I already mentioned, the political momentum currently favors an upgrade of the role of fiscal policy in a more active sense. And maybe that will only change when the European Central Bank begins to conduct more normal policies that show that there's a risk also that interest rates could rise, not only in step with the slightly rising inflation rate, but also faster than that once we get closer to full capacity utilization. So the old view of the risk of allowing debt to rise to very high levels can be revived on this basis. Fourth, and this is the truly novel element that Jakob Effel referred to it, is that whereas it has been the tradition in the past that there was no interference from the European Union or from the EU in the composition of expenditures and revenues in member states, only some guidelines for the aggregates. The poor level of investment, public investment in Europe, particularly following the financial crisis, has led to a more activist attitude also towards the composition. And that's, of course, where the Recovery and Resilience Facility comes in. That is, unfortunately, in our view, only a temporary mechanism. It is scheduled to last until 2026. One could hope that the good habits of reorienting expenditure somewhat towards growth-enhancing public expenditures in the long term will produce some roots in countries. But we are, I think, also required to formulate some ideas on how a satisfactory level of investment, particularly in the light of the green transition, could be preserved also beyond 2026. The objection to exempting certain categories of expenditure has always been that it was too vague. National finance officials are abhorred by the idea of just saying a golden rule, we can accept all public investment from rules. We cannot do that, but the green transition may offer a more precise delimitation of expenditures that have indeed a high priority at the European level and should find their place also beyond 2026 in national budgets. So this requires a special treatment of the investment component in that case.
Thanks so much, Niels. I would ask if you have one last thing to wrap up.
Thank you very much. I've been a bit long. I see you are going both into the political and the technical issues. I welcome that very much. There's a certain convergence on many of the more technical issues, but the task is a difficult one, and the difficulties are mainly on the political side. So I look forward also to what our next speaker, Professor Suedekum, can tell us about views in Germany on these issues. Thank you very much.
Super, thanks so much, Niels. And we look forward to having you engage in the discussion on the political feasibility on the proposals, which will be one of the breakout sessions. So thanks so much for setting the context there. And that was a really useful and brief summary, and also from the perspective of the Fiscal Board. So I will very briefly just hand over to Jens Suedekum, who is a professional of international economics in Düsseldorf Institute for Competition Economics, and who's also holds advisory positions with the member of the Scientific Advisory Board within the Federal Ministry of Economics in Germany, as well as a number of other such advisory positions. So Jens, please take it away. Thank you so much.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Thrilled to be with you. And so you probably know, I mean, we just had elections 3 days ago, and I was asked to give like a little reflection on what these elections may mean for fiscal policy, both in Germany and in Europe. And what the honest answer is, I don't know yet, because we have no idea how the next government will look like. I mean, there's some speculation. So all I'm saying today is pretty much speculation about what may come out of the election and about the implications that this may have for fiscal policy. So first of all, I guess you probably have followed that there are essentially two constellations that could emerge from the election. So first, the good news is both the extremes, both on the right wing, the AfD, and on the left wing, they have decreased substantially in vote shares. So there will be a coalition and a German government from the middle of the spectrum, which is, I guess, good news. And it can be either a coalition led by Olaf Scholz, the former finance ministry from the Social Democrats, together with the Liberals and the Green Party, or alternatively, maybe slightly less likely, following the events of the previous days, a coalition led by the Christian Democrats, so Angela Merkel's party with Chancellor Armin Laschet, and also the Liberals and the Green Party, right? So this is the situation. At the moment, there are first tentative talks between the three parties, actually among the Liberal and the Green Party, so the two small parties. They are currently negotiating, just the two of them, and also kind of forming an opinion with which of the two bigger parties they want to form, ultimately the government. But when the next government will actually be set up is open. I think my gut feeling tells me that we have a good chance that it will be completed before Christmas, but we don't know. I mean, there are many surprises that could happen along the way. So now to fiscal policy, I would like to divide my remarks first on the national aspects and then on the European aspects. And I should say the national fiscal policy and generally all national policy issues have been so much more prominent in the election campaign than everything related to foreign policy or European issues. So there was a heavy critique that European issues, international issues, global issues have played a tiny role in the election campaign. All of that was basically focused on either trivial things or on national policy issues. But I mean, we had a long discussion in the previous years about the national fiscal rules, so the German debt brake, and possible ways of reforming that. Right? So I guess you're all aware of that discussion that many people, including myself, have criticized the German debt brake for being much too strict, limiting fiscal policy in Germany, limiting in particular investment in Germany. And that was true even before the corona pandemic, but also now afterwards when it comes to the recovery and also the green transition. So we have pulled the escape clause from the debt brake, and that will also be the case for 2022, most likely. But then by 2023, that's the current outlook, it will be enforced again. And that will mean not only that we have to divert or go back to the debt brake with a maximum structural deficit of 0.35% of GDP, but starting in 2025, there will be mandatory repayments of all the corona debts that were accumulated during the emergency phase now. So we're talking roughly about 400 billion euro, and there would be a repayment scheme starting in 2025, basically limiting the structural component and the fiscal space, if you want, that Germany would have afterwards. So there is this discussion and reform options also for the next government. Frankly, a reform of the constitutional debt brake within the German constitution is basically off the table. It just will not happen, okay? It has been enshrined by the reforms in 2009. It would take a 2/3 majority to reform it again, and that is nowhere to be seen, right? So we basically don't have to discuss this issue. But there are two possible reforms that are discussed right now about how to operate within the given set of rules that we have, and that will not change. So the first would be something like what Niels said, the golden rule type of thing. Not formally speaking, but basically about setting up vehicles. I would call them special purpose vehicles or off-balance sheet vehicles that would facilitate certain degree or certain types of public investment, but that would not be counted within the framework of the debt brake. Okay, so one example would be railway, right? So the German railway company Deutsche Bahn, that's 100% publicly owned enterprise, and when they go into debt, for example, to build new railway, right? That debt would not be counted for the German debt brake because Deutsche Bahn is essentially a company that is operating in the market. Okay, so if you could set up similar vehicles, right? So, for example, for setting up a digital infrastructure for 5G networks or things like this, it is conceivable that you can basically form such vehicles, and the debt that they would make for their infrastructure investments would not be counted. Okay, it's less of an economics, more legal issue because you have to be very careful how to design these vehicles because they have to be independent. If they are directly dependent on the government, and if basically Parliament exerts control over these vehicles, as it maybe should for certain types of public investment, right? Then their debt would be counted. So it's really like a very difficult legal issue. Right? So this is the one reform option we're having on the table. The second one is basically the business cycle cyclical component of the debt brake, right? So of course we have this capacity utilization, or we have the potential output, right? And then there's fiscal space depending on the distance between actual and potential output. And you all probably are aware of this discussion, how potential output is measured. It's pretty much a black box often, right? Or it appears to be like a black box. And there are many little tweaks you can make, right? And if you make them, potential output changes, and with it, the fiscal space that you would have in the cyclical component, right? And so there are proposals floating around in the German discussion, basically on which buttons you can push in order to increase the fiscal space. So I guess this will be something that the new government will contemplate, because it's a very technocratic way to just increase your fiscal space without much of the general public not even noticing it, because people don't understand how this machine works. But frankly speaking, I mean, I think it has limited impact for Germany, because Germany within the Eurozone doesn't have like this key problem of underutilization, right, of basically structural underemployment. It's rather the opposite, right, with our current account surplus that we run year after year. So I think this discussion, and that brings me now to the European discussion, will be much more important on the European level, right? So the measurement of potential output and of output gaps is, I guess, key for countries like Italy and Spain, and it has a really big impact there. So I think that discussion is really important, basically how to measure output gaps. I mean, you probably know about this initiative called nonsense output gaps that is around there. So basically saying countries like Italy or Spain with a youth unemployment rate of almost 40%, that basically the machine tells us that Italy is almost running at capacity level, basically saying that 40% of youth unemployment is a structural feature. I mean, frankly, this is complete nonsense, right? A rule that gives you this result is complete nonsense. So there must be a change. And that discussion is, I think, very important for the European level. So, but generally speaking, I mean, what will be the German position on European fiscal rules? Frankly, I don't know yet, because as I said, I mean, this has not been really discussed in the election campaign. It will also depend a bit, I guess, I mean, who will be the next finance minister. I mean, there are already stories floating around that Europe is afraid of Christian Lindner, the head of the Liberals, becoming German finance minister. So I don't know what to say about that. But generally speaking, what I believe at the European level, there are two big options we have to discuss. The first would be a reform of the Stability and Growth Pact and of existing fiscal rules. The other one would be basically to contemplate the Recovery Fund, the Next Generation EU Fund, and basically contemplating the possibility of turning that from a one-off to a more or less permanent instrument for European fiscal policy at the European level. And to give you my feeling right away, I think the second reform option is much more promising, okay? Frankly, because, you know, reforming the existing national fiscal rules requires unanimity within Europe. I don't see that this can happen easily. Actually, I'm not talking about the small reforms, the measurement of output gaps, but formally a reform of the fiscal rules, the Stability and Growth Pact, the Maastricht criteria and all that. I mean, from an economic point of view, it would all make sense. I mean, Jakob basically told the story, and I agree, right? Those old rules don't make sense anymore, considering the macroeconomic situation that we are in today, right? We don't have to discuss this right now, but I mean, actually implementing that reform, changing national fiscal rules is utterly difficult, and I don't see that this can happen easily. Turning to the the Recovery Fund, Next Generation EU. So basically, it's the charming thing. I mean, it was a new instrument, right? I guess it was sort of a surprise that Germany did not settle with the frugal 4 or the frugal 5, where its usual position would be, right? But it was actually strongly pushing for that instrument together with France. And actually, what I'm seeing in Berlin, the discussion and so on, is actually that there is, in principle, a willingness to contemplate that for a reform option of saying, okay, now the recovery corona from the pandemic is done. Now we have the climate crisis, we have the European Green Deal. It's obvious we need money for that, right? So basically we're talking about a Green Deal fund of a similar size maybe, right? And have basically this very elegant construction. It's not Euro bonds, right? It is this, it's still, right, basically the obligations, you know how it works, that basically the single member states are basically just pay according to their contribution to the EU budget, right? So I think this is a very elegant design, and I think the chances are much higher to go along that route, right? The necessary condition, and that's my last remark, is I think this will only happen when the recovery fund is considered a success widely in the general public. So if the money that is coming, basically, and Jakob gave us the numbers, almost equivalent to 10% of GDP, right? And basically, if the conclusion is that this money is basically just wasted on, unproductive types of government spending, or just crowding out national spending types, and doesn't really give a value added in terms of investment, then basically, if that conclusion is settled in the general public, there will be no follow-up, right? That's for sure. I think the necessary condition is that the general public in Germany and in other countries actually sees the recovery fund as a success, meaning that it has created value, and then ultimately will be basically self-financing, right? In the sense that it has such a impulse on growth that basically servicing the debt later on will be no problem, right? If that necessary condition is met, I can see basically that second reform option turning the recovery fund into a permanent vehicle. I can see that as a likely outcome, and I can see a next German government basically going down that route. Okay, let me leave it here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jens. And I appreciate that we got a bit of the broader historical context, a bit of the German context, and I realized we gave you the very hard task to comment on an election, which was only a few days ago. So that was very tricky, but you handled it well. So thanks so much for sharing your perspective. I will gladly hand over to Thomas Wieser now, who's an economist and former president of the Economic and Financial Committee of the EU, former president of the Eurogroup Working Group, and has also held a number of other similar positions. So Thomas Wieser, please, we would love to hear your insights next.
So thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. I can be very brief, about 10 seconds, because everything has been said. And I have utterly nothing to add in reality. But since you invited me, I'll spend a couple of minutes of repeating what others have been saying in great detail. In our initial conversations, you said I should talk a little bit about what is feasible and what's meaningful. And these two very definitely are not the same. People have been complaining about the SGP for many years and even decades. Romano Prodi called it stupid. It was based on nominal values, but easy to handle. So people decided that it should be become more intelligent, i.e. based more on economics, and upon which we did, and it became complex, and we were totally unable to handle it well, and quite a number of the issues have already been highlighted. First and foremost, probably that you're trying to deal with potential output. Somebody said it was, I think it was Jens, like a black box. Maybe it's like Schrödinger's cat, I'm not quite sure. But any pretense of being able to see where fiscal policy will be going is hopeless. We introduced, not right at the beginning of becoming intelligent, the 1/20th rule, where I struggled to find anybody who still thinks it's meaningful for everybody. And we were united in saying the SGP is a catastrophe, but coming from different sides of the Alps. There was the more Nordic view that said the SGP and everything is not working, Why? Well, just look at Italian debt levels. If it were working, Italy would not have the debt that it has. Whereas the Mediterranean view was the SGP is utter nonsense because it is completely constrained and restrained public investment and therefore contributed to the low rates of growth and potential output growth, which we could talk about that for an hour. But anyway, there's agreement that the blighter doesn't work. We switched horses in midstream, changing from, let's say, an more important role of member states, i.e. the council, towards a more invasive and important role of the Commission. Many people thought, great, we've got this stringent and strict Commission, so they will exert pressure and there will be more fiscal discipline. What happened? The Commission became more concerned that member states would be more upset. Lucio will disagree, and became more political. That was Jean-Claude Juncker and the political Commission, to which people north of the Alps said, it's not political, it's politicized. So in German one says, der Standort bestimmt die Haltung, which I find difficult to translate, but it depends on where you're standing. We've been doing work recently with a couple of member states looking at the future of fiscal policy. Future of fiscal policy, debt developments given the extremely low interest rate environment. Niels, whom I greet, was also mentioning that. We were advised by all sorts of rocket scientists who are saying interest rates will stay low forever, and therefore sustainability for France, which was one of the countries we were working at, is given at 300% of debt to GDP. I've been looking at at forward rates recently, so I've got news for the rocket scientists. There were others who said, well, interest rates may stay low for quite a long time, but there's a risk management element in there. You never know. So maybe bring debt down and don't go up to 300%, go down significantly. And then there were those who said, well, I don't know, when the pandemic struck, there were these huge differences in fiscal reaction possibilities and how markets approach that, depending on whether you were Germany with low debt to GDP or Italy with higher debt to GDP. So voila, there we are. Now, what's feasible, what's meaningful? Picking up a bit on what Jens was saying, will Germany be constrained by EU rules, or will the EU be constrained by Germany? And quite obviously, Germany will not be constrained by EU rules, but the EU may very well be constrained by Germany. Will there be significant reforms, or will there be certain reforms, or will there be changes in practice? I think we're all agreed, probably, with having only heard Niels and Jens, that significant changes in the sense that there will be a revamp of primary law. Give me a break. Will there be a significant revamp where unanimity will be required? That I also doubt very much, because everybody is afraid of everybody else. The North is afraid that if you open up the can of worms, the South will the Mediterraneans will weasel towards very weak rules. And the Mediterranean countries are afraid that if they open the can of worms, the Calvinists will pounce on them and insist on very strict interpretation of existing rules. And as long as growth remains G larger, R, life in the short and medium term appears to be good. So what I think we can easily do away with, I don't know if formally or just in practice, is the 1/20th rule of reducing debt by 1/20th of the excess over 60%, which in reality has never played a role. It was something that was, in my perception, thrown to the Calvinists in order to come forward in the financial crisis. I think it is feasible to move towards more, let's say, a nominalistic way of looking at things, significantly weakening the role that potential output plays. If you do that, you have to have a view which is of a more longer term nature than the present sort of fine-tuning of fiscal policy prescriptions. But on paper, I am pretty much convinced that a large part of the rules will remain with us. I turn to the golden rule, where especially Mediterranean countries have been hacking away at us for the last 2 decades to take more account of that, and which is now switching to investments in the context of the ecological transformation. I also don't believe that a generalized exemption of ecological investment will be formally hardwired into the pact. I think there will be maybe a more lenient treatment of the adjustment path. Maybe it will become flatter, but it will not change, at least it will not change the 3%. It will not change significantly, I think, the medium-term objective, but maybe the path until one gets there. I turn to what Jens was saying about, and I close there, what Jens was saying about putting up special purpose vehicles. I've been looking at these vehicles for many, many years. And the question is, does Eurostat, does the system of national accounts facilitate moving things off budget and therefore not being counted as debt and therefore not being counted as deficit relevant? And that is extremely difficult. It would presumably presuppose that public funds are not involved and that there is also no contingent liability on the public balance sheet when I last looked. But let's hope that something is possible there. So why will things not change more? Because the FDP will be in the coalition in Berlin, either with the CDU or with the SPD, and they will be the binding constraint of changing things. So I stop here. This is not a very positive outlook, but if one wants to realistically change things, concentrate on the small little levers that we have, and it's not like Dante who said, "Leave behind all hope who enter here," but it's more make yourself comfortable where you know that you will be being by changing the small aspects, the lighting and the trajectory on which you're operating. Hopefully not been too long. Happy to answer questions, pluriel, if so desired. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Thomas. And I appreciate the diversity of views and the perspective that you shared in addition and in complementing the others. So thanks so much for your reflections.
Many thanks. I have started my video. Do you see me?
Yes, we can see you. Thanks.
Probably you will see that I'm a bit older than in the picture that has been distributed at the beginning. It's the fault of my secretary. It's not my own vanity. This was about 10 or 12 years ago. No, many thanks for inviting me. I will just really make some off-the-cuff remark, not just because I did not have time to prepare myself for this event, but also because the nature of the event is quite original. I said it mixed, and I would like to compliment the organizer of this, because it mixed, let's say, views of experts that was presented in the initial part with an original analysis carried out by the ZOE Institute. I found also I called the analysis original because I must say I like the matrix that was used: political feasibility, technical feasibility, quantitative impact, and leaving aside also the qualitative aspect that were less discussed. Having said that, I should say that when it comes, and I will not go into the detail because this would clearly take a long time, when it comes to the assessment of specific proposal, as also our discussion has shown, I mean, you can differ very much. So it's very difficult to put the places, the dot in the matrix at a point on which everybody would agree. I think the discussion of the off-budget mechanism illustrated that, as I said, and also I think as Thomas Wieser said earlier, I'm rather skeptical when it comes to the EU rules. I mean, it may well be that this is the way to escape the stricture of, say, German national rule. Clearly, you will not expect that I anticipate to you what the Commission intends to put forward in the next few months, for obvious professional reason, but also for the most fundamental reason that the consultation, as President von der Leyen has announced in the State of the Union speech, is now to be resumed. Will genuinely listen to what stakeholders will have to say before coming up with orientation. So, more modestly, what I can try to do in the few minutes that remain is to tell you something in connection with things that I've heard. I mean, especially in the observation of the beginning. I say I will not be able to go into the detail of each and every proposal because this would be simply too long. So let me begin by the consideration, to join some of the consideration made at the beginning by Niels, who is an old friend. I'm very happy to see him here. We have met each other recently after a long time when we could meet only via video link. I think Niels, who has the most experience of all in this. I mean, sometimes people say that, well, I'm a old hand of the pack. That may be true, but compared to Niels, my experience is nothing. Recall the original rationale for having rules in EMU. And I think that by and large, this stands. It seems to me difficult to contemplate this unique creature, which is a European Monetary Union, without fiscal rules. The big alternative is the one of the markets. It was mentioned, and interestingly, it was the discussion that took place already many years ago. And I think the events, not everybody may not agree, the events tend to prove the wisdom of the drafter of the law report that argued that this discipline of the market could not be relied upon. So rules. There I would say that the philosophy, there has been a very big change, I mean, compared to the situation we are there. I mean, there are many changes and Niels went through. I think a problem that we have, and frankly, we are not very well equipped to deal with in a context of rule-based fiscal policy, is the constraint on monetary policy, which were simply not contemplated at the time of the Maastricht Treaty and thereafter. Why so? Because, as Niels recalled, back at the time, it was felt that rules were there to protect against spillover, but the spillover came from essentially deficit and debt that were simply too excessive. So this was the mechanism contemplated. It was not contemplated with equal attention the case of spillover coming possibly from a stabilization gap, in the sense of lack of demand, which monetary policy cannot cope with. So in other words, it was felt that anyway, monetary policy would be always able to provide the necessary degree of stabilization for the euro area as a whole. So this is also the origin of, I believe, of the fashion for fiscal activism that Niels has mentioned. I think the key origin, so it is in the economy, the situation that we have, and that I think no economist contemplated back at the time. So this brings me to a point that actually was not raised in the discussion, which has a bearing on the discussion of the future. Right now, we know, as you know, we are in a situation in which effectively the rules of the pact are set aside through the recourse of the so-called general escape clause. I think that any new set of fiscal rules still need to contain a robust escape clause, which, and this is not articulated clearly in the current rule for the reason that I mentioned before, which takes into account the constraint that monetary policy can face. So it's not just looking at the issue, do we have such a profound crisis that monetary policy could not conceivably cope with? We may have in a situation in which a simple recession and not a particularly severe economic downturn demands recourse to discretionary monetary policy. So this is one point that I would like to make, which I believe was not made in the debate explicitly in relation to the framework, although there was a question about the interaction of fiscal monetary policy, which I think it was very pertinent. I will not intervene. I mean, I listened with great interest what would be said about the German debate. I don't feel competent enough to intervene. Let me make a remark on a point that was part of a more general discussion, that is the issue of golden rule or a potential application to green expenditure. I think also Niels made a reference to that, and Thomas as well. I see potentially a special case for, and I would not go into the detail, it could take many forms, for some special treatment of the expenditure linked to green investment. Why? Because here we are dealing with, at least if we are thinking of climate change, I mean, there are many other dimensions, but again, for the purpose of simplification, I would focus to that. Why? Because we are dealing with the provision of a genuine public good, EU public good, or if you wish, worldwide public good. So not something, the advantage of which are internalized by each country, you know, something which not necessarily contribute to growth in the short to medium term, because much of the green investment, let's face it, correspond to accelerated depreciation of the current capital stock, which needs to be renewed in order to satisfy the green requirement, not because it's no longer, it has come at the end of its natural productive life. Ideally, the solution to this would be what has been called a Green Deal Fund. There, my question is one of political feasibility, so I don't have particular authority about that. I was a bit surprised to hear that between a reform of the rule of making NGU permanent, the second is more politically feasible from, say, a German perspective. It has been pointed out, both of them require unanimity. And in fact, although I'm not a lawyer, the Next Generation EU was presented, I mean, also legally speaking, as something unique, presented not only politically, but also in terms of the extremely complex and controversial legal construction that allow essentially the EU to incur debt, which is based on an article of the treaty, Article 122.2, which explicitly refer to an emergency. So I would not make it so easy, even from the legal point of view, when it comes to the political point of view, as I said, other people may have as much or more insight that I have on the issue. But so there, the point I want to make, I think I would be, for one, I would be happy. I should have said at the beginning, of course, that expressing my personal view. I'm not and not those of the Commission, but I think most people in Brussels, I think Niels also would be happy to see some kind of Green Deal fund. In a sense, it would be less controversial than Next Generation EU because it would not entail transfer from the rich to the poor country, would entail some kind of mutualization of debt incurred for the provision of a common EU good. So that would be an excellent solution if were feasible. I've just big question mark on its political feasibility. Then I come to the point of, since I've spoken of the political feasibility, the point that was addressed most directly in the remarks made by Thomas, who is also an old friend. I was happy to see after a long time, and I have to say that I tend to agree with this practical wisdom. The Commission, the President, as you have seen in her speech, has mentioned the need to have a consensus. The consensus is not easy to achieve. The legal hurdles are those of unanimity, as you have. Let me conclude by saying that one should, and this comes from my long experience in the practical field, one should not underestimate what can be obtained by way of reinterpretation of the rule. Many things have changed over time, not because the law has changed, but because a certain consensus has been reached to reinterpret things. And so some of the point that Thomas has put in front, for example, doing away with the so-called debt reduction benchmark, a more medium-term approach of fiscal policy, which I think are fairly uncontroversial, would be best achieved through a reform of the rule. But I would just, and I would stop here, don't underestimate what is possible by way of interpretation. Possibly, and to conclude, reinterpretation being a first step, if it is shown to work, toward the broader reform of the fiscal framework. And here I hope I have not exceeded too much my time, and I thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much, Lucio, and that was fantastic to hear not only your reflection on the discussion we've had so far, but I also really appreciate your willingness to share with us your personal ideas and some additional insights for us to think about. So that was a fantastic summary and way to close. So thank you so much.